A freezing night in New York. A homeless teenager stumbles upon a figure collapsed in the snow. What happens next will challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, humanity, and second chances. Watch to uncover a story that will leave you speechless. If you believe in the power of kindness, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. The storm raged through New York City with a vengeance. Snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the streets in icy white, while the wind howled between the skyscrapers, cutting through coats and scarves as if they weren't even there. For most of the city's inhabitants, it was a night to stay indoors, huddled around heaters and hot drinks, but for Mike, there was no such luxury. 16 years old, black and homeless, he had learned to survive these brutal winters with only his wits and whatever scraps of warmth he could find. He pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his thin frame, the icy wind biting at his exposed skin. His fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled with the zipper that never quite closed all the way. His worn sneakers barely protected his feet from the slushy streets as he trudged through the snow, searching for shelter. The abandoned building he sometimes used had been locked up the night before, leaving him to wander aimlessly. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he kept moving. To stop meant to freeze, and he wasn't ready to give up yet. The streets were eerily empty, save for the occasional cab or plow truck. Even the usual hum of the city had been muffled by the snow. It was in this unsettling quiet that Mike first noticed the figure stumbling ahead of him, silhouetted against the glow of a distant street lamp. The man, clearly disoriented, teetered on his feet before collapsing onto the sidewalk. Mike froze. His first instinct was to turn the other way. Getting involved was dangerous. He'd learned that the hard way. But as he stood there, staring at the unmoving form, a voice echoed in his mind, the voice of his grandmother. "Always help, Mikey, no matter who it is. Your heart shows who you are, not theirs." He clenched his fists, hesitating. What if the man was dangerous? What if someone accused Mike of doing something to him? Still, he couldn't just leave him there. Steeling himself, he approached cautiously. As he got closer, the figure came into focus. A man in a long, expensive coat, his face pale and drawn. Mike's breath caught when recognition hit him. Even under the dim street light and frost-covered features, the man's identity was unmistakable. He had seen that face on TV, heard that voice in speeches. It was Donald Trump, the former President of the United States. Mike hesitated, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt. Trump was the last person he wanted to help. The man had spoken out against people like him, against the homeless, calling them a blight on the city. He had supported policies that made Mike's life even harder. And yet, here he was, collapsed in the snow, looking more human than Mike had ever seen him. His grandmother's voice came back louder this time. "Your heart shows who you are, Mikey." "Damn it," Mike muttered under his breath as he knelt beside Trump. The man's breathing was shallow, his skin cold and clammy. Mike shook him gently. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. His pulse was weak, but it was there. Mike scanned the street, but no one else was around. Of course, no one would be out in weather like this. Mike pulled off his only source of warmth, a ratty old blanket he had found days ago, and draped it over Trump's body. The cold hit him immediately, making him shiver uncontrollably, but he ignored it. Fumbling with his pocket, he pulled out his cracked phone, the only thing of value he owned, and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? There's a man. He collapsed. Mike stammered, his teeth chattering. "I think he's having a heart attack or something. He's not responding. We're on West 57th, near the park." "Can you describe him?" the operator asked, their voice calm but insistent. Mike hesitated. "It's Donald Trump." The line went silent for a moment before the operator responded. "An ambulance is on the way. Stay with him and try to keep him warm." "Yeah, okay," Mike said, though he wasn't sure how much more he could do. He crouched down, shielding Trump's face from the wind as best he could. His fingers were numb and his body shook from the cold, but he stayed. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a wave of relief. Help was coming. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics jumped out, but their expressions shifted the moment they saw Mike, a black teenager in ragged clothes hovering over the body of a wealthy white man. One of them immediately stepped forward, their voice sharp. "Step away from him." Mike raised his hands. "I'm the one who called you. He needs help. He's having a heart attack." The paramedic narrowed their eyes, glancing between Mike and Trump. "We'll handle it from here. Stay where we can see you." Anger flared in Mike's chest, but he bit it back. He had no choice but to comply. As they worked on Trump, hooking him up to oxygen and checking his vitals, another paramedic eyed Mike suspiciously. "What were you doing here? How'd you find him?" "I was walking," Mike said, his voice flat. "I saw him fall, so I helped." The paramedic didn't look convinced, but before they could press further, another interrupted. "He's stabilizing. Let's move." They loaded Trump into the ambulance, but as they were about to leave, one of the paramedics turned back to Mike. "Why'd you stay? Why help him?" Mike shrugged, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Because he needed it." With that, the ambulance doors closed and the sirens wailed as they sped away. Mike stood there for a moment, watching the tail lights disappear into the snowstorm. His body screamed for warmth, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. He wanted to feel good about what he'd done, but all he felt was empty. Turning away, he trudged back into the storm, searching once again for a place to sleep. Mike's breath came out in visible puffs as he trudged through the snow, his body shivering uncontrollably. The blanket he had given to Trump had been his only shield against the freezing air, and now the icy wind cut through his thin coat like a knife. His sneakers, soaked and caked with snow, squished with every step, but he couldn't afford to stop. Stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant dying. He turned down a side street, hoping to find an overhang or doorway where he could huddle until the storm passed. Each gust of wind seemed to mock him, howling through the empty streets and throwing icy flakes against his face. He replayed the scene in his mind, the way the paramedics had looked at him like he was a criminal, the sharp, accusatory tone in their voices, the disbelief that someone like him, a homeless black kid, could be trying to help. Anger simmered in his chest, but he forced it down. Getting angry wouldn't change anything. It never did. Mike finally found a narrow alley where the wind wasn't as strong. He crouched behind a dumpster, curling in on himself to conserve what little warmth he had left. His fingers, red and stiff, barely responded as he tried to adjust his coat. His stomach growled loudly, but the hunger was easy to ignore. He'd lived with it for so long that it had become just another part of him, like the cold or the stares from strangers. He pulled his knees to his chest, trying to block out the world, but the doubts crept in anyway. Why had he helped Trump? The man had never done anything for people like him. In fact, Trump had made things worse, calling homeless people criminals and problems to be swept off the streets. But as much as Mike tried to convince himself he should have walked away, he couldn't forget the way Trump had looked. Helpless and fragile, just a human being in need. His grandmother's words rang in his head. Your heart shows who you are, Mikey, not who they are. The storm raged on, snow piling up against the dumpster. Mike's body felt heavier with every passing moment, his eyelids drooping. He knew he couldn't fall asleep, not here, not in this cold, but his body wasn't listening. Just a few minutes, he thought. Just rest for a moment. His head tilted forward, his breathing slow and shallow. Mike? A voice jolted him awake. He blinked, disoriented, as a shadow loomed over him. It was Crystal, a street kid he knew from the shelter circuit. She was a little older than him, maybe 17, and tough as nails. Her face was partially hidden by a scarf, but her eyes were sharp and worried. You're gonna freeze to death out here, she said, yanking him to his feet. Come on, I know a spot. Mike stumbled after her, too cold and tired to argue. She led him through a maze of alleys and side streets until they reached an old warehouse. Inside, a group of other street kids huddled around a small makeshift fire built in a metal drum. The heat was weak, barely more than a flicker, but it was better than nothing. Crystal shoved Mike toward the fire. Sit, warm up. Mike collapsed onto the ground, holding his hands out to the flames. The other kids gave him curious looks, but no one said anything. Crystal handed him a half-eaten sandwich from her bag. He hesitated, pride making him want to refuse, but hunger won out. He devoured the food in seconds, barely tasting it. What happened to your blanket? Crystal asked, crouching beside him. Mike hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. Gave it to someone. Her eyes narrowed. Who? Mike sighed, knowing she wouldn't drop it. Trump. I found him in the snow. He was having a heart attack or something. Called 911, gave him my blanket, and waited for the ambulance. Crystal stared at him like he'd just said the dumbest thing in the world. You're telling me you froze your ass off to save Trump, the same guy who calls us street rats? Mike shrugged. He needed help. Crystal shook her head, muttering under her breath. You're too good for your own damn good, Mike. The other kids murmured among themselves, a mix of disbelief and admiration. One of them, a skinny boy named Tommy, grinned. You're a hero, man. Mike snorted. Yeah, sure. A hero sleeping behind dumpsters. Crystal punched him lightly on the shoulder. Doesn't matter where you sleep. What you did, that's real. Not many people would have done it. Mike didn't respond. He wasn't sure he believed her. All he could think about was the way the paramedics had looked at him, the suspicion in their voices. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a statistic, a nobody who would have been ignored if the roles were reversed. The warehouse grew quieter as the night dragged on. One by one, the kids fell asleep, wrapped in whatever scraps of warmth they could find. Mike stayed awake, staring into the dying fire. His body still ached from the cold, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. He kept seeing Trump's pale face, kept hearing the paramedics' accusatory questions, and underneath it all, his grandmother's voice, Your heart shows who you are. As dawn broke, the storm began to let up. Light seeped through the cracks in the warehouse walls, weak and gray. Mike stretched his stiff limbs and stood, his joints protesting. He didn't know what the day would bring, but he had a feeling it wasn't over. The world had a way of finding you, especially when you didn't want to be found. The sun broke through the clouds the next morning, casting a pale, cold light over the city. Snow still blanketed the streets, and the air was sharp with the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. Mike was already on the move, his feet crunching through the frozen slush. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind. The collapse, the call to 911, the way the paramedics had looked at him. He couldn't shake the feeling of their suspicion, their quick judgment. It wasn't anything new. He'd felt it countless times before, but this time it stung worse. He had saved a man's life, but to them, he was still just a black kid in rags. The city was waking up around him. People bundled in coats and scarves as they rushed to work or to grab coffee. Mike blended into the background, invisible as always. He passed a bakery where the smell of fresh bread made his stomach growl. His fingers found the last quarter in his pocket, but he knew it wasn't enough for anything. He kept walking, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. The streets were busier near Times Square. People hurried past him, their faces buried in phones, oblivious to the world around them. Mike paused at an electronics store, the windows filled with rows of glowing TVs. He barely noticed the news anchors at first, their voices blending with the city noise. But then something caught his attention. On nearly every screen, a video was playing, grainy security footage of a snowy street. A figure in a ragged coat was kneeling over a man on the ground, draping a blanket over him. Mike's heart stopped. It was him. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, "Homeless Teen Saves Former President Donald Trump During Snowstorm." For a moment, he just stood there, his mind racing. How had they gotten the footage? How did they even know it was him? His chest tightened as the cameras zoomed in on his face, barely visible under his hood. They didn't say his name, probably because they didn't know it yet, but they were looking for him. The anchors were talking about how incredible it was that a homeless teenager had saved Trump's life. But Mike knew better. He wasn't a hero to them. He was a story. He stepped back from the window, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had to get away, had to disappear before someone recognized him. But as he turned to leave, he bumped into a man holding a camera. The man's eyes widened as he looked at Mike. "Hey, wait a second. Are you the kid from the video?" "No," Mike muttered, pulling his hood down lower and shoving past him. But it was too late. The man called out, and suddenly others were turning to look. A woman pulled out her phone, holding it up to film him. "That's him!" someone shouted. Panic surged through Mike as more people started to gather, their voices a blur of excitement and curiosity. He bolted, weaving through the crowd and into the nearest alley. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he ran, his sneakers slipping on the icy ground. He didn't stop until he was sure no one was following him, ducking into the shadow of a fire escape to catch his breath. His heart was racing and his hands were shaking. Not from the cold, but from fear. He didn't know what to do. He had wanted to stay invisible, to avoid the attention that always brought trouble. Now, it seemed the whole city was looking for him. "Mike?" a familiar voice called softly. He turned to see Crystal standing at the end of the alley, her scarf pulled up to her nose. She looked both worried and amused. "You're all over the news, you know." "I saw," he said, his voice low. "It's bad, Crystal. They're going to find me." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "And what? You didn't do anything wrong. You saved that guy." Mike shook his head. "You don't get it. They're not going to see it like that. They're going to twist it, make it into something it's not. I can't deal with that." Crystal crossed her arms, studying him. "You think running's going to help? You're already famous. It's not going away." He leaned against the wall, letting out a shaky breath. "What am I supposed to do? Go on TV? Shake hands with Trump? Pretend like everything's fine?" She shrugged. Maybe, or maybe you tell them your story, let them know who you really are. Not the kid in the video, but the real you." Mike didn't answer. He didn't know if he could do that, if he even wanted to. Being invisible had its downsides, but it was safe. This wasn't. Crystal sighed, pulling her phone from her pocket. "Well, you better decide fast. They're looking for you everywhere. It's only a matter of time." Her words hung in the air as Mike stared at the ground. He thought about the people who had walked past Trump without stopping, the paramedics who had assumed the worst about him. And then he thought about his grandmother's voice, about what she would have wanted him to do. Before he could say anything, the distant sound of sirens cut through the air. Crystal glanced toward the street, her expression hardening. "Come on, we need to move." They slipped through the maze of alleys, avoiding the main streets where reporters were likely to be lurking. Crystal led him to an old warehouse on the edge of the city, a place she said was safe for now. Inside, a few other street kids were gathered, their faces tense as they whispered among themselves. One of them, a boy named Tommy, looked up as they entered. "Dude, it's all over the internet," Tommy said, holding up his phone. "They're calling you a hero." Mike didn't respond, sinking down onto a crate. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a kid who had made a mistake, one that was now spiraling out of control. As the others talked around him, he stayed silent, trying to block out their voices. But one thing Crystal had said kept echoing in his mind. Maybe you tell them your story. He didn't know if he had the courage to do it, but one thing was certain. His life would never be the same. The storm had passed, but for Mike, the chaos was only beginning. News vans crowded the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, while reporters huddled in heavy coats, talking animatedly into their microphones. Everywhere he turned, screens showed his face, grainy, hooded, crouching over the former president in the snow. Social media exploded with hashtags like #HomelessHero and #MikeSavesTrump. Mike stayed hidden in the warehouse with Crystal and the others, but the tension was unbearable. He felt like a trapped animal waiting for the inevitable. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Tommy and the other kids kept looking at Mike like he was a celebrity, but he didn't feel like one. He sat in a corner, his arms wrapped around his knees, trying to ignore the buzz of their phones and the snippets of news they kept reading aloud. "They're saying Trump's condition is stable now," Tommy announced, scrolling through an article. "Doctors said if he hadn't gotten help when he did, he might not have made it." Crystal shot Mike a glance. "So, what are you gonna do? You can't stay in here forever." "I don't know," Mike mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for any of this." Crystal crouched beside him, her tone softer than usual. "I get that. But you're in it now. You can't just pretend it didn't happen." Mike shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "They don't care about me. They care about the story. As soon as they're done with it, I'll be right back where I started, on the street, invisible." Crystal sighed, sitting down next to him. "Maybe. But what if you can use this? What if you can make them listen, make them actually see what it's like for us out here?" Mike didn't respond. He wasn't sure he believed her. All his life, people had ignored him or looked right through him. Why would this be any different? The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the warehouse door. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. A second knock followed, louder this time. Crystal motioned for the others to stay quiet as she crept toward the door. Peering through a crack, she stiffened. "It's him!" Mike's heart jumped. "Who?" "Trump's people," Crystal whispered. "There's a guy in a suit out there, and he's not alone." Mike's stomach churned as he stood, his legs unsteady. "What do they want?" "Only one way to find out," Crystal said, opening the door just enough to speak through the gap. "What do you want?" A man's voice answered, calm and measured. "We're looking for Michael Johnson. We know he's here." Crystal turned to Mike, her eyes questioning. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to run. But then he thought of his grandmother's voice, her belief in doing the right thing, no matter how hard it was. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. Crystal opened the door wider, revealing a tall man in an expensive suit flanked by two others. The man's gaze softened when he saw Mike. "Michael, my name is Richard Martinez. I work for Mr. Trump. He's asked to meet you." Mike crossed his arms, his voice wary. "Why?" Martinez's expression didn't change. "He wants to thank you, and he wants to hear your story." The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Mike glanced at Crystal, who gave him a slight nod. Turning back to Martinez, he asked, "And if I don't want to go?" "That's your choice," Martinez said evenly, "but I think this could be an opportunity for both of you." Mike felt torn. He didn't trust these men or their polished smiles, but a small part of him was curious. What could Trump possibly want from him? "Can she come with me?" he asked, nodding toward Crystal. Martinez hesitated, then nodded. "If that's what you want." Crystal raised an eyebrow. "Guess I'm your bodyguard now." Mike forced a faint smile, though his nerves were anything but calm. "Let's get this over with." The ride to the hospital was surreal. Martinez's car was sleek and warm, a stark contrast to the cold, hard streets Mike was used to. Crystal sat beside him, her eyes scanning everything like a hawk. Mike kept his head down, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. He felt out of place, like he didn't belong in something so clean and polished. When they arrived, a crowd of reporters swarmed the entrance. Cameras flashed and voices shouted questions as the car pulled up. Security guards cleared a path, but Mike could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on him. His breath quickened as he stepped out, Crystal's hand on his shoulder grounding him. Inside, the hospital was quieter but no less overwhelming. They were led down a series of hallways until they reached a private room. Martinez stopped at the door, gesturing for them to wait. "He's awake and waiting for you. Just take your time." Mike swallowed hard as the door opened. The room was spacious and filled with sunlight. Trump sat in a recliner, his complexion healthier than it had been in the snowstorm, though he still looked tired. His eyes locked onto Mike the moment he entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Trump broke the silence. "You're younger than I expected." Mike shrugged, unsure how to respond. "You're alive?" Trump chuckled, the sound softer than Mike expected. "Thanks to you." The room fell quiet again. Mike shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Crystal, who gave him a small nod. Gathering his courage, he said, "Why do you want to see me?" Trump leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Because you didn't have to help me, but you did. I want to know why." Mike hesitated, then spoke honestly. "Because you needed it, that's all." Trump nodded slowly. "Even after everything I've said about homeless people, about people like you?" Mike's jaw tightened. "Words don't matter when someone's dying, but they do when you're alive." The room grew still, the weight of Mike's words hanging in the air. Trump looked away, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said quietly, "and I've been wrong about a lot. Mike didn't know what to say to that, so he stayed silent. After a moment, Trump turned back to him. I want to help. Not just you, but others like you. People who've been ignored for too long. Mike stared at him, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Why? Trump's voice was steady but sincere. Because you showed me what it means to care about someone, no matter who they are, and because it's the right thing to do. Mike felt a lump rise in his throat but forced it down. He still didn't know if he could trust Trump, but for the first time he thought maybe, just maybe, things could change. Mike sat in the back seat of the car, the leather soft beneath him, but he couldn't relax. The meeting with Trump had been strange. Not bad, exactly, but strange. He had expected anger, maybe even condescension, but instead Trump had listened. Really listened. And now, here he was, riding in another sleek car with Crystal beside him, heading to a follow-up meeting at Trump Tower. The city blurred past the windows, snow still piled high along the sidewalks. Crystal was quiet, her arms crossed as she stared out at the passing buildings. Mike could tell she was on edge, but he didn't blame her. He felt the same. The idea of stepping into Trump Tower, a place so far removed from everything they knew, made his stomach churn. "You good?" Crystal asked, breaking the silence. Mike nodded, though his hands fidgeted in his lap. "Yeah, I think so. You?" Crystal snorted. "Not really. This is some next-level weirdness, you know? Us in Trump Tower? Feels like a setup." Mike managed a weak smile. "Maybe it is. But if it's not..." Crystal glanced at him, her expression softening. "If it's not, it could be something big." The car pulled up to the grand entrance of Trump Tower, where a small crowd of reporters had already gathered. Security guards held them back, their presence intimidating, as the driver opened the door for Mike and Crystal. Stepping out into the cold air, Mike could feel the weight of the cameras on him, their lenses tracking his every move. He kept his head down, Crystal sticking close to his side. Inside, the warmth hit them immediately, along with the overwhelming grandeur. Everything gleamed. Gold, marble, glass. It was a stark contrast to the streets they had just come from, and Mike felt small, out of place. A security guard approached, his demeanor polite but firm. "Mr. Johnson, this way." They were led through the lavish lobby and into a private elevator. The ride up was silent, the only sound the soft hum of the machinery. Crystal stood with her arms crossed, her eyes darting around as if expecting a trap. Mike focused on his breathing, trying to steady his nerves. When the doors opened, they stepped into a large, airy room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. A group of people waited inside, lawyers in suits, a few social workers, and Trump himself. He stood near a table covered in papers, his expression surprisingly warm. "Michael," Trump said, stepping forward. "Crystal, thank you for coming." Crystal raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Mike nodded, his throat dry. Trump gestured to the table. "I asked you here because I want to get your input. If we're going to make a difference, we need to do it right. And who better to help us understand than someone who's lived it?" Mike stared at him, unsure how to respond. He glanced at the papers on the table, blueprints, charts, budgets. It all looked overwhelming, like something from a world he didn't belong to. "You want my input?" Trump nodded. "Exactly. I've made mistakes, said things I regret, but I want to fix that. I want to build something real, something that can actually help people." Mike hesitated, his mind racing. He thought about the kids he'd shared streets and shelters with, about the nights spent shivering in the cold, the hunger that never went away. Slowly, He stepped closer to the table, Crystal following at his side. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But if we're doing this, it has to be real. No PR stunts, no red tape that keeps people from getting help. It has to actually work." Trump's expression didn't falter. "Agreed. Tell me what you need." Mike exchanged a glance with Crystal, who gave him a small nod. Taking a deep breath, he started to speak. He talked about the shelters that turned people away for not having IDs, about the kids who avoided them because they were unsafe. He explained how families were often split up, with parents sent one way and children another, and how that fear kept people on the streets. Crystal chimed in, adding her own experiences and ideas. The lawyers took notes, their pens flying across notepads. The social workers listened intently, occasionally nodding in agreement. Trump remained silent. His gaze focused on Mike and Crystal as they spoke. It felt strange, surreal, but also empowering. For the first time, Mike felt like someone was actually listening, not just hearing him, but really listening. After what felt like hours, the discussion came to an end. Trump stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Michael, Crystal, I want you both involved in this project, not just as advisors, but as partners. We're going to build something that changes lives." Mike blinked, stunned. "Partners?" Trump nodded. "You understand the problem better than anyone else here. I need your voices in this." Crystal crossed her arms. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Trump said simply. "Just a chance to make things better." Mike looked at Crystal, who gave him a long, searching look. Finally, she shrugged. "Guess we're in." Trump smiled, extending a hand. Mike hesitated for a moment before shaking it, the gesture feeling strange but significant. This was real. It was happening. As they left the tower later, the sun setting over the city, Mike felt a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something new, something better. Crystal nudged him as they walked, a rare smile on her face. "Looks like you're not invisible anymore," she said. Mike laughed softly, the sound surprising even himself. "Yeah? Guess not." The next few weeks were a whirlwind for Mike. Meetings, phone calls, and planning sessions filled his days, leaving little time to process everything that was happening. He had gone from a nameless face on the streets to someone whose voice mattered in rooms full of powerful people. It felt unreal, like he had stepped into someone else's life. Yet, every time he spoke about the struggles of homeless kids, about what it was really like to live on the margins, the room would go quiet and people would listen. Trump had kept his word. The project was moving forward quickly, with plans for the first youth center taking shape. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a place designed to feel like home. Mike and Crystal had insisted on private rooms instead of dormitories, on spaces where kids could feel safe and respected. There would be counselors, medical care, and even a school program to help kids catch up on their education. For the first time, it felt like someone was actually addressing the problem instead of just putting a Band-Aid on it. But it wasn't easy. Not everyone supported the project, and there were plenty of obstacles. City officials were skeptical, questioning the funding and the logistics. Some media outlets called it a publicity stunt, accusing Trump of using Mike to repair his image. Even some of the social workers involved in the project doubted whether it could work, though they rarely said it outright. Mike felt the pressure constantly. Every decision felt monumental, and he worried about getting it wrong. Crystal tried to reassure him, but even she had her doubts. "You can't fix everything overnight," she said one evening as they sat in the small office space Trump had given them to use. "But you're doing something, and that's more than most people." Mike nodded, though the weight of responsibility still sat heavy on his shoulders. "I just don't want to mess it up. What if it doesn't work? What if it doesn't help anyone?" Crystal gave him a sharp look. "It's already helping. Just you being here, telling your story, is making people pay attention. That's more than they were doing before." Her words gave him some comfort, but the doubts lingered. He couldn't help but think about all the kids still out there, the ones he had left behind when he stepped into this new world. He thought about Tommy, about the younger kids who looked up to him, about the ones who might not make it through another winter. Every time he felt like giving up, he reminded himself that this wasn't just about him. It was about them. One day, during a particularly tense meeting with city officials, Mike finally snapped. They were arguing about permits and zoning laws, about whether the center should even be allowed in the neighborhood where it was planned. The officials spoke in circles, using language that seemed designed to confuse and stall. Finally, Mike couldn't take it anymore. "Do you even know what it's like out there?" he asked, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you know what it's like to sleep in a doorway because every shelter turns you away? To be treated like you're less than human because you don't have an address? This isn't just a building we're talking about. It's a chance for kids to feel safe, to feel seen. And if you can't understand that, maybe you shouldn't be in this room." The silence that followed was deafening. Mike's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. For the first time, he saw something shift in their faces. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just the realization that he wasn't going to back down. Either way, the conversation moved forward, and by the end of the meeting, they had reached an agreement to proceed. That night, Trump called Mike personally to thank him. "You've got a way of getting through to people," he said. "Don't lose that." Mike wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't feel like he had done anything special. He had just told the truth. But hearing Trump acknowledge it meant something, even if he didn't want to admit it. As the weeks went on, the project began to take shape. The blueprints turned into a construction site, and the construction site started to resemble a building. Mike and Crystal visited often, walking through the dusty halls and imagining what it would be like when it was finished. They brought some of the other kids from the streets to see it, asking for their input and making changes based on their feedback. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was happening. The media continued to follow the story, and Mike found himself in front of cameras more often than he liked. Reporters asked him about everything: his life on the streets, his thoughts on Trump, his hopes for the future. He answered as honestly as he could, but he hated the attention. It felt like they were more interested in the drama of his story than in the kids he was trying to help. One day, after a particularly grueling interview, Crystal found him sitting on the edge of the construction site, staring out at the city. She sat down beside him, her expression serious. "You okay?" Mike shrugged. "Just tired. Feels like everyone's watching, waiting for me to screw up." Crystal nudged him with her shoulder. "You're not going to screw up. You've already done more than anyone expected. And if they're watching, make them see what really matters." Mike nodded, her words sinking in. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep trying. As the opening day of the center approached, the pressure only grew, but so did the hope. Mike could see it in the faces of the kids who came to visit, in the way they lit up when they talked about what the center could mean for them. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. When the building was finally finished It stood as a symbol of everything they had worked for. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a home, a place where kids could feel safe and start over. And as Mike stood in front of it, looking at the sign that bore his name and Trump's, he realized that this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time he believed they could do it. The morning of the grand opening was crisp and clear, the city sparkling under the winter sun. Mike stood in front of the building, staring at the gleaming sign that read Johnson Trump Youth Center. The name still felt surreal to him, a reminder of how far he'd come in such a short time. The center was everything they had envisioned: private rooms, counseling offices, a school program, and even a rooftop garden named after Mike's grandmother. It was more than a building. It was a lifeline for kids like him who had spent too long feeling invisible. The street in front of the center was packed. News vans lined the block and reporters jostled for position behind the barricades. Local officials and community leaders mingled with social workers and volunteers, their faces a mix of curiosity and excitement. But what stood out most to Mike were the kids. They hovered on the edges of the crowd, some with wary expressions, others openly hopeful. They were the reason he had pushed through all the doubts, the endless meetings, the pressure. Today was for them. Crystal appeared at his side, dressed in a borrowed coat that was a little too big for her. She grinned, nudging him with her elbow. "You ready for this?" Mike let out a nervous laugh. "Not even a little." She smirked. "Well, too bad. They're waiting." Trump was already at the podium, speaking to the crowd. His tone was softer than the bluster Mike had seen on TV. His words more measured. He talked about the journey that had brought them here, about the importance of helping those who had been left behind. But when he looked toward Mike, his expression changed. There was something real in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "And now," Trump said, stepping aside, "I'd like to introduce the young man who made all of this possible. Michael Johnson." The crowd erupted into applause as Mike stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He gripped the edges of the podium, scanning the sea of faces before him. His mother was in the front row, tears streaming down her face. Crystal stood off to the side, giving him an encouraging nod. He took a deep breath, the words he had rehearsed swirling in his mind. "1 year ago," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves, "I was homeless. I was sleeping in alleys, scavenging for food, and trying to survive another day. Back then, I didn't think anyone saw me. Not really. I was just another face on the street, another problem people walk past." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But that night in the snow, when I saw someone lying on the ground, I didn't think about who he was or what he'd said about people like me. I just saw someone who needed help. And I helped because that's what you do when you see someone in need. It doesn't matter who they are." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Mike swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This center isn't just a building. It's a promise. A promise that no kid will ever have to feel invisible again. A promise that we'll see them, help them, give them the tools they need to build a better future. Because every life matters. Every single one. The applause was deafening, but Mike barely heard it. He stepped back from the podium, letting the moment wash over him. Trump joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder as they walked toward the ribbon stretched across the entrance. Crystal handed Mike the oversized scissors, her grin wide. "For everyone who needs a second chance, Mike said, his voice firm. For everyone who's ever felt invisible, Trump added. Together, they cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Kids began filing into the center, their faces lighting up as they explored the warm, welcoming spaces inside. Mike stayed outside for a moment, watching as everything he'd worked for came to life. His mother approached, wrapping him in a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Mike smiled, tears pricking his eyes. "Thanks, Mom." Crystal appeared beside him, her hands stuffed in her pockets. "Looks like you pulled it off, Johnson." "Not just me," Mike said, his voice quiet. "All of us." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the city in a golden glow, Mike stood on the rooftop garden, looking out over the streets below. It wasn't perfect. There were still kids out there who needed help, still problems that needed solving. But for the first time, he felt like they were making progress, like they were building something that could last. Trump joined him, his movements slower but purposeful. "You did good today, Michael." Mike nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did." Trump smiled, his expression thoughtful. "You know, a year ago, I thought power meant building walls, owning the tallest buildings, making the loudest speeches. But you showed me something different. Real power is in helping others, in building bridges." Mike turned to him, his voice steady. "It's not about power. It's about people." Trump nodded, a rare look of understanding in his eyes. "You're right. And you've got something special, Michael. Don't lose it." As they stood there, the city lights flickering to life below, Mike felt a quiet sense of peace. This was just the beginning. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time he believed they could do it. Together they had built something real, something that mattered. And that was only the start. What started as a simple act of kindness turned into a story that changed lives forever. What would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.